Zack Taylor was too good for the version of Power Rangers he was given. And I don't mean the audience misunderstood him. The audience got Zack immediately. He was funny, stylish, physical, warm, and impossible not to watch. He was the guy who made the youth center feel alive. He was the guy who could turn a fight scene into choreography without making it feel like a joke. He was the ranger who brought the room up just by walking into it. But the writing rarely treated him like someone who could carry the room. That is the tension with Zack. He was popular, but he was not always taken seriously. He was visible, but not always explored. He had charisma, loyalty, fear, confidence, humor, physicality, and heart. But the show mostly kept sending him back to the same lane. Be fun, be cool, make the scene lighter, then move aside when the emotional weight arrived. And the more I think about it, the more I think that was a much bigger missed opportunity than it looks like at first. Because Zack Taylor was not just comic relief. He was not just the Black Ranger who danced when he fought. He was one of the original 5 people Zordon trusted with the fate of the world. He was Jason's best friend. He was one of the emotional engines of the team. And if the show had ever forced itself to look at him differently, it might have found something genuinely special sitting there the whole time. So here's the question. What if the show had finally taken Zack Taylor seriously at the exact moment Mighty Morphin Power Rangers needed a new symbol? What if the person chosen for that symbol was not Tommy Oliver? What if Zack Taylor became the White Ranger? That is the version of Season 2 I want to talk about today. Not because Tommy didn't work, he did. Not because Jason David Frank's legacy needs to be reduced, it does not. But because Zack's version of this story would have been completely different, warmer, stranger, more emotionally surprising, and maybe one of the richest roads the show never took. Before we get into anything else, I want to say something directly. Jason David Frank passed away in November 2022. And he spent nearly 3 decades being the heart of this franchise in a way that no other actor ever quite managed. His Tommy Oliver defined what Power Rangers leadership looked like for an entire generation. It never could be. What we are doing here is imagining a different road, not erasing the one that exists. The work Jason David Frank put in as the White Ranger, and as every version of Tommy that followed, across Zeo and Turbo and In Space and Dino Thunder and everything else, was real and it mattered, and it always will. That does not change. What we're asking is a separate question. What was Zack Taylor actually capable of? And did we ever genuinely get to find out? I think the honest answer is no. And I think that's one of the Mighty Morphin era's most underexamined missed opportunities. So let's get into it properly. First, if you're new around here, welcome. It's awesome to have you. On this channel, we talk about Power Ranger what-ifs and more. So if you vibe with the content, consider subscribing. Alright, let's place this in context first. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Season 2 starts airing in 1994, and the show is in a genuinely strange moment. Season 1 was a phenomenon. Not a moderate success, not a decent kids show, a cultural event. Toy sales were through the roof. Playgrounds everywhere had kids arguing about which ranger they were. Nobody had anticipated it at quite that scale. Not Saban, not Fox Kids, possibly not even Toei, given what they'd originally made. And so Season 2 arrives, carrying enormous pressure to maintain that momentum. And it arrives with a structural problem already baked in. Tommy Oliver's Green Ranger powers are dying. By late Season 1, the Green Candle made that explicit. And the arc through the tail end of Season 1 and the early going of Season 2 is actually compelling television for what it is. A hero who keeps showing up, knowing his powers might cut out at the worst possible moment, choosing to fight anyway, watching that light flicker. That is good storytelling. It earned genuine emotional investment from the audience. But alongside that story, there was a production situation unfolding that had nothing to do with the writing. Austin St. John, Walter Jones, and Thuy Trang, Jason, Zack, and Trini were part of the widely discussed contract dispute around the original cast's exit. The exact terms of what had been agreed, what was being offered, and what the expectations were on both sides have been reported and retold over the years in different ways. So the cleanest version is simply this: the situation did not resolve cleanly on screen. And so by the time Season 2 reaches what we now know as the power transfer, those 3 original Rangers are written out. Rocky, Adam, and Aisha come in. The transition is abrupt. Anyone watching at the time felt it, even if they were 8 years old and couldn't have explained why. So here's what the show was managing simultaneously in Season 2. It had to phase out 3 of its 5 core original cast members. It had to introduce 3 replacements. It had to sustain narrative pressure under Lord Zed, who arrives in the mutiny with a sharper, colder, more threatening register than Rita ever had. And on top of all of that, the show had to figure out what came next for Tommy Oliver once the Green Ranger powers were definitively gone. The answer was the White Ranger. And it was a good answer commercially and narratively. It kept Jason David Frank. It gave Tommy a fresh start, a new power, a new Zord in Tiger Zord, a talking sword in Saba, and an elevation in status. He became the team leader, stepping into the role that Jason had held since Day of the Dumpster. The White Light two-parter, episodes 17 and 18 of Season 2, made a genuine event out of the reveal. The production leaned into it. It worked. But here is what it cost. Zack Taylor disappeared. Not just in the sense that Walter Jones left the show, because that outcome was going to happen one way or another, given the reported contract situation. What I mean is that Zack Taylor, the character, across the entire run of his time on the show, never got a single moment that matched what he was actually capable of. Not in Season 1. Not in the early episodes of Season 2 before the handover. He was written as the fun one, the hip one, the one who danced while he fought, the one who made jokes at the youth center, the one who had a crush on Angela, and handled it with more charm than success. He was the energy source of the original team. That was genuinely valuable. But it was not all he was, and the show never found out what the rest of him looked like. And this is worth pausing on. Zack was enormously popular. Kids loved him. He was the character you wanted at the party, the one who made the youth center scenes feel like somewhere you actually wanted to be. He was marketable. He was fun. And yet, despite all of that surface popularity, the writing never went deeper than the surface. The Black Ranger was one of the most visible and commercially resonant members of the original team, and the show used that visibility almost entirely to run the same function week after week. He was the energy, the warmth, the comic timing, and then the episode moved on. The popularity was real, the underwriting was equally real. Both things were true simultaneously, and the gap between them is exactly where this conversation lives. Walter Jones is a genuinely talented performer. Watch him in the moments where Zack is pushed into something heavier, and you can see it clearly. The episode built around his fear of spiders, where he has to work through genuine terror largely by himself, gives you a version of Zack that is more layered and more emotionally honest than the scripts usually allowed. His loyalty to the team, in moments where it costs him something personally, a date, a chance at something normal, always had weight in Jones's hands, even when the writing treated it as light. He brought warmth and physicality and a specific kind of ease on screen that made you want to keep watching him. And the show mostly used that to have him crack jokes and do a dance move before a fight. The what if starts there. What if the show had looked at what Walter Jones could actually do, at what Zack Taylor already was beneath the surface writing, and made a different call? For this to work narratively, you need a slightly adjusted version of the early Season 2 story, though the structural bones don't have to change dramatically. The Green Ranger powers still burn out. Tommy still loses them in Green No More. That's not in question. But in this version, during the weeks between Green No More and White Light, when Zordon and Alpha are secretly building new powers, those powers are being built for Zack, not Tommy. Now ask yourself whether that is actually narratively coherent. In the actual show, the White Ranger powers are framed as the light-coated answer to evil and corruption, and the strong implication is that Tommy is uniquely suited to receive them because of his redemption arc. He went into darkness and came back to the light. That journey is the thematic engine of the choice Zordon makes. But think about what Zack's version of that journey looks like. It is quieter, and it has never been fully told, but the bones of it are right there in the show. Zack was one of the Rangers the show allowed to look visibly afraid. Not in a way that undermined him, but in a way that felt honest and human. He got scared. He pushed through anyway. He had doubts that he rarely voiced, but that Walter Jones put in the performance, whether the script asked for them or not. And he has something that Tommy, in his early White Ranger iteration, did not lead with as strongly. Warmth without distance. Tommy, even after fully turning good, could read as slightly apart from the group, because of the story he had already lived through. The former villain trying to prove himself. The brooding outsider working to earn back trust. That is a compelling character arc. But Zack was never an outsider. He was never trying to earn anything. He was already inside, already part of the family, already the person the team turned to, not for orders, but for something less definable. That sense that everything was going to be okay, because Zack was there, and Zack always found a way. Zordon choosing Zack doesn't just make sense, it makes the team feel more like a team. There's a production angle worth considering too, though I want to be careful here, because this is where fan reasoning can easily start pretending to be documented fact. If Walter Jones stays in this what if, We are already changing the real-world outcome, so I don't want to pretend the behind-the-scenes logic maps cleanly. For story purposes, Jason and Trini still exit, while Zack remains. So the Season 2 roster in this alternate version has Zack as White Ranger and team leader, Rocky and Aisha coming in alongside Adam, Billy keeping blue, and Kimberly keeping pink. Jason exits, and the handoff from Jason to Zack, best friend passing the torch to best friend, has real emotional gravity that the actual show never got to use. Not just a leadership transition, not just a costume change. Let me be specific about what changes in Season 2 if this happens, because the details matter. The first thing that shifts is the dynamic with Lord Zed. Zed arrives in the mutiny as a genuinely new kind of threat. Aggressive, contemptuous, personally invested in their destruction in a way Rita never quite was. In the actual show, the White Ranger's arrival frustrates Zed, but doesn't particularly destabilize him. Tommy is a known variable, another warrior to counter. Zack as White Ranger creates a different problem for Zed, and it starts with the fighting style. The show frames Zack's movement as hip-hop Kido, a blend of street dance energy and martial arts staging that made his fights aesthetically distinct from anything else on the show. Now imagine that fighting style backed by White Ranger power levels, wielding Saba, piloting Tiger Zord. The visual language alone would have been genuinely unusual television. Zack's fluid, improvisational, almost playful movement against the rigid mechanical brutality of Lord Zed's monsters is a contrast the show would have had to lean into, and it would have worked. It would have made the White Ranger feel like a different kind of power than anything Zed had faced before. But the more important change is in how the team actually functions, and to talk about that properly, you have to talk about the specific people in that team and what Zack means to each of them. Start with Jason. The relationship between Zack and Jason is the closest friendship the original team had. They are shown as genuine best friends from the very beginning, not just teammates, but people who clearly existed together before the Rangers, who have a shorthand and a history. When Tommy came into the team, Jason's relationship with him developed warmth, but it was always a slightly more formal warmth. Tommy was someone Jason grew to trust. Zack was someone Jason already knew entirely. In the actual show, when Jason leaves in the power transfer, Tommy has been the White Ranger and team leader for a stretch of episodes. The transition is narratively clean, but emotionally thin. In this alternate version, Jason leaves knowing that Zack is the one standing at the front. And that exit scene, if written with any honesty at all, it's two people who have been through every version of impossible together. One of them stepping away, the other one carrying it forward. Jason doesn't need to explain why he trusts Zack with this. He just does. And Zack doesn't need to prove he deserves it. He already has. That is a much better goodbye than the one the show actually gave us. Now think about Billy. Billy Cranston is the Ranger who is most frequently underestimated in combat terms, and most frequently relied upon in strategic terms. His relationship with each team leader is slightly different, because what Billy needs from a leader isn't validation. He's too self-aware for that. It's genuine inclusion. He needs to feel that his analysis matters, that the person leading the team is actually listening, and not just nodding politely before going with their gut anyway. Jason did that reasonably well. Tommy did it reasonably well. But Zack would have done it differently, and I think better, because Zack's style of leadership is inherently consultative. He doesn't arrive at decisions by projecting authority downward. He arrives at them by pulling the room together. There's also something specific to the Zack and Billy dynamic that the show set up and never paid off. These two have a warmth in Season 1 that is quietly genuine, the kind of friendship that exists between people who seem like they shouldn't naturally click and do anyway. Billy with his technical precision and social caution, Zack with his improvisational energy and easy social grace. In small moments across Season 1, you can see that they genuinely like each other, that there's something there, and the show never builds on it because it never builds on most of what Zack has going. Under Zack's leadership, Billy doesn't just have a leader who listens to him. He has a leader who already likes him and already trusts him, and that history changes the texture of every strategic conversation they have. For Billy, who spent a lot of Season 1 being the smart one who got talked over in battle situations, having a leader who genuinely wanted his input before acting on it would have changed the dynamic on the team in ways that ripple outward. Billy becomes more confident, Billy's voice carries more weight. And the Billy-Zack dynamic, which the show set up warmly in Season 1 without ever really developing it, becomes one of the quiet engines of the alternate Season 2. Kimberly's relationship with Zack in the alternate version is worth thinking through carefully. In the actual show, the Tommy and Kimberly romance is the emotional through line of the civilian side storytelling through Season 2 and into Season 3. It gives the series a consistent heartbeat at the personal level that isn't about fighting monsters. In this alternate version, that specific romance doesn't exist in the same form, or at least doesn't occupy the same structural position. But Kimberly and Zack have a rapport that was always one of the most natural and easy things on screen in Season 1. She makes him laugh, he makes her feel seen. They are friends in the real sense, not just teammates being polite to each other. What that relationship becomes in a version of the show where Zack is carrying the weight of leadership, where Kimberly is processing Jason's exit, and navigating her own growing sense that her time as a ranger might be limited, is genuinely interesting to consider. She would be one of the people Zack leans on privately, not for strategy, but for perspective. For the check-in that leaders don't always ask for, but almost always need. And Kimberly would give it honestly, which is exactly the kind of honesty that Zack, as a leader who leads through warmth rather than distance, is most capable of actually receiving. That friendship under pressure, between two people who already know each other well and are now navigating something neither of them planned for, would have been one of the better ongoing civilian side dynamics the show ever produced. Trini's departure in this timeline still happens. She is part of the reported contract situation involving Austin St. John and Thuy Trang, not Walter Jones. And so her exit is not something this alternate version avoids. But what it does change is the weight of that exit on Zack specifically. In the actual show, all three of them leave together and the team absorbs the loss collectively. In this version, Zack loses both of his two closest original friends in one go, Jason and Trini, gone at the same time. And he is now the White Ranger team leader of a squad that is suddenly half new and all grieving. The question of how he holds that together, whether he lets anyone see how much it costs him, whether the humor that has always been his first language becomes armor or becomes genuine. That is the emotional spine of this alternate Season 2. And it is rich. It is genuinely rich. Which brings us to Rocky, Aisha, and Adam, because in the alternate Season 2, their relationship with Zack matters enormously. Rocky DeSantos is confident and warm and slightly more comedically inclined than Jason was, which means his dynamic with Zack carries a different energy than Rocky's dynamic with Tommy in the actual show. Rocky in the actual continuity is often positioned as the slightly goofy Red Ranger in a show already dominated by a more serious leader. Under Zack's leadership, Rocky's humor doesn't have to compete with anyone's. He and Zack can be the two people in the room who make the tension break without undermining the seriousness of what they're all doing. They would have been good together. There's a natural respect that would have formed between them quickly, partly because Rocky is exactly the kind of person who knows when someone is genuinely the leader and responds to that organically. Rocky also would have learned something from watching Zack lead, even if neither of them ever made that explicit. He would have seen that you could be warm and funny and still be the most important person in the room when it mattered. For a character who in the actual show sometimes seems to be searching for where he fits without quite landing anywhere, that model of leadership would have given Rocky something to grow toward. Aisha Campbell brings something specific that the alternate Season 2 needs. She is direct, emotionally perceptive, not easily impressed, and completely without patience for pretension. She would have read Zack immediately and correctly, understood that the warmth was real, that the humor was real, but that there was something more serious underneath both of them. Aisha would not have been dazzled by the White Ranger upgrade. She would have been curious about the person underneath it. And that curiosity would have pushed Zack to articulate things about his leadership style and his responsibilities that the show's version of him never had to put into words. Having someone new on the team who asks the honest questions without malice is one of the best things that can happen to a leader who has been doing the job by instinct. Aisha would have been, in that sense, the most valuable new addition the alternate Season 2 could have given Zack. Not because she challenges him aggressively, but because she takes him seriously, in a way that requires him to take himself seriously. And for a character who spent his entire Season 1 run being underestimated by the writing around him, being taken seriously by someone as perceptive as Aisha is quietly transformative. And then there is Adam Park. Adam is in many ways the most quietly interesting character of the Season 2 replacement trio. He comes in uncertain, watchful, deeply loyal, but not immediately vocal about it. He observes before he commits. He supports before he leads. And in a team under Zack's leadership, Adam's particular qualities find a different kind of expression than they do under Tommy's leadership in the actual show. Because Zack, as a leader, actively draws people out. He doesn't wait for you to prove yourself and then acknowledge it. He finds where you're already strong and puts you there before you've asked. For Adam, who spends much of the actual season 2 and beyond feeling like the perpetually undersold member of the team, being led by someone whose entire leadership style is about making sure nobody gets missed, that would have been transformative. There is a version of Adam Park that exists if he spends his formative Ranger months under Zack's leadership rather than Tommy's. He learns earlier that quiet competence is enough, that you don't have to push yourself to the front to matter, that a leader who is paying attention will find you. The Adam Park that the franchise eventually gave us across Zeo and Turbo is excellent, but the Adam Park who developed under Zack Taylor's leadership might have gotten there faster, and with a stronger foundation. Now let's talk about what happens when Season 3 approaches, and about Tommy's position in this alternate version. Because this is where I think the conversation gets most genuinely interesting. In the actual show, Tommy is the constant through Season 2, Season 3, and Zeo. Everything orbits him. Every departure and arrival is mapped against his continued presence. He is, structurally, the sun that the franchise organizes itself around through the entire Zordon era, right up to Turbo. That is both a tribute to how effective the character was, and, honestly, a slight limitation on how interesting the team dynamics could ever get. When one character is always the center, the others are always orbiting. And orbiting characters only ever have so much space to become something fully themselves. In this alternate version, Tommy is still here in Season 2 and Season 3. He's a Ranger. He's capable. He's got a history with this team that is genuinely complicated and genuinely valuable. But he is not the leader. He is not the White Ranger. He is a warrior on a team led by someone who was there before him and who carries a different kind of authority. And that version of Tommy, the gifted, committed, slightly complicated Ranger who is not the top of the hierarchy, is a character the franchise almost never explored, and would have been genuinely worth seeing. What does Tommy become when he's not the most important person in the room? What does he find out about himself? How does he relate to a leader he didn't expect to follow? There is a whole season of character work in those questions that the actual show never asked. And the answers, worked out properly, might have made Tommy a more interesting long-term character, rather than a less important one. By the time the Mighty Morphin era transitions into Zeo, the questions multiply. The Zeo Crystal assignment, as the show presented it, worked on a compatibility logic that was never exhaustively explained. In the actual timeline, Tommy becomes Zeo Ranger 5 Red, and reassumes the leadership mantle without much friction. In the alternate version, Zack is still on the team. What does the Zeo Crystal say about him? Where does he fit in the new structure? These are speculative questions, and I'm not going to pretend I have clean answers. The further you get from the point of divergence, the more honestly uncertain the projection becomes. But the downstream questions are genuinely interesting, and interesting downstream questions are the whole point of a what-if like this. Let me spend some real time on the thing I think matters most to this conversation, and that is how Zack's humor functions as leadership rather than comedy relief. Because I think this distinction is the key to understanding what the show failed to do with him and what the alternate version would have done differently. In the actual show, Zack's humor is deployed as color. He's the one who lightens the mood, who breaks the tension with a quip, who makes the youth center scenes feel warm rather than earnest. That is a legitimate function, but it stays exactly there. It is never shown to be strategic. It is never shown to be deliberate. The show treats it as personality rather than practice. But watch what actually happens in the moments when Zack's humor lands in a group setting. The tension changes. People breathe out. The thing that was about to become fear or frustration becomes manageable. That is not an accident, and it is not trivial. That is a person who understands at some level that the story a group tells itself about its own situation determines whether it survives the situation. When Zack makes a joke at the right moment in the original team, he is doing something functionally similar to what a good coach does in a timeout, or what a good commander does when a unit has been in the field too long. He is recalibrating the group's emotional state. What makes this even more interesting is that the humor is not Zack's only emotional register. Watch him in the moments where the joke would be the wrong call, and he knows it. He doesn't always reach for it. There are quieter moments in Season 1 where he simply sits with someone, or where he listens without filling the space with sound, and those moments are in the performance, even when the script doesn't explicitly write for them. Walter Jones understood something about Zack that the writers mostly didn't, which is that the humor is expressive of a deeper emotional intelligence rather than a substitute for it. He's not funny because he can't be serious. He's funny because he's perceptive enough to know when funny is exactly what the room needs. A show willing to surface that would have had Zack understand what he's doing. Not necessarily an explicit dialogue. You don't have to have him sit down and explain his leadership philosophy. You just have to show that the moments where he uses humor are chosen moments, that there are times when he decides not to make the joke because the team needs the weight of the silence. That there are times when the joke is the most important thing he can do, and he knows it. The difference between Zack as comic relief and Zack as leader is not that one version is funny and the other isn't. Both versions are funny. The difference is agency. It's whether he knows what he's doing. That version of the character is an entirely different kind of role model. Not the stoic hero who carries everything in silence and never lets you see the cost. Not the magnetic outsider who earns the room with talent and drama. But the person who understands that what the people around him are feeling matters, that keeping them capable of functioning is part of the job, and that sometimes the most serious thing you can do is make someone laugh. For a kids' show in 1994, that is a remarkable lesson. And the foundation for it was sitting right there in Walter Jones's performance every week. Let me now directly address the most common objection to this kind of conversation, because I think it deserves a serious answer. The objection is some version of, Tommy was always going to be the White Ranger. That's his story. You can't lift that arc and put it on someone else. And on its own terms, that's not wrong. The specific arc, Evil Ranger becomes Good Ranger, loses powers through sacrifice, gets chosen for a pure new power as a kind of culmination, that arc was built on Tommy's history, and it would not transfer identically to Zack. But we are not asking for Tommy's story with a different face on it. We are asking what Zack's version of that story would be, and Zack's version would be genuinely different in ways that are worth thinking through. Tommy's arc is a redemption story. It builds on darkness. The light at the end means more because of what came before it. Zack's arc would not be that. Zack's arc would be an elevation story. The reveal of the White Ranger as Zack Taylor is not the show saying that someone has come back from the edge. It is the show saying that the person who has been holding the edge in place all along was more important than you realized. You thought you understood him. You didn't have the full picture. For the show's audience in 1994, those are both valuable messages. The redemption story says damaged people can recover and be trusted again. The elevation story says the person who has always been there, always consistent, always warm, always showing up, they matter more than the obvious hero does. They might be the most important person in the room, and you missed it because they weren't performing importance. There is something quietly powerful about that second message, especially for a kids' show whose characters were so racially coded in their Ranger identities. The franchise has addressed that history directly in the years since, with varying degrees of success. But in the moment, in 1994, having the Black Ranger revealed as the one Zordon trusted above all others, as the White Ranger, as the leader, that is not a small thing. That lands differently for a portion of the audience than Tommy emerging from that chamber ever could. And I don't think the show was thinking in those terms at the time. I don't think that was the calculation being made. But the effect is real, regardless of whether the intent was there. Good storytelling often does more than it knows. Now let's actually answer the ranking question properly, because I raised it and I should deliver on it. Where does Zack Taylor, as White Ranger team leader in this alternate version, rank among the Power Rangers leaders across the franchise? And I want to be careful here, because this is the kind of question that goes off the rails quickly when people are measuring different things. There are several ways to measure Power Rangers leadership. Combat effectiveness is one, plot centrality is another, emotional range, the ability to play the full spectrum of what the role demands, is a third. And then there is what I think is the most honest measure for a show that is fundamentally about teamwork, team cohesion. How well does this team function when this person is in charge? By that standard, let's put some markers down. Jason Lee Scott is the foundational template. He built the original culture from scratch with no precedent, and he did it through a combination of personal authority and genuine care for his team. The original Rangers function as well as they do because Jason set the tone early and held it consistently. His leadership is classical, firm, decisive. He leads from the front, and he doesn't always explain his reasoning, but he's almost always right, and the team knows it. The weakness of Jason's style, if it has one, is that it doesn't leave a lot of room for doubt, for uncertainty, for the moments when the leader genuinely doesn't know what to do and needs to lean on the team rather than project confidence at them. TJ Johnson, the Red Turbo and later Blue Space Ranger, is one of the most underrated leaders in the franchise's history, and I will defend that position. TJ leads through inclusion. He draws people in. He makes every member of the team feel like they are genuinely part of the decision, not just receiving orders from above. Selwyn Ward brought something very specific to that role. A real openness, a genuine warmth that came across even in the frequently chaotic context of Turbo and early in space. And the team under TJ functions with a trust that is collective rather than individual. The weakness of TJ's style, if it has one, is that it can read as low-key in moments where the team needs urgency and projected confidence more than it needs a conversation. Andros carries in space and earns his place at the top of most serious conversations about Zordon-era leadership through sheer emotional cost. He carries more than any other leader, and it shows. The finale of In Space is the argument for Andros. He made the hardest choice the franchise ever asked of a character, and he made it knowing what it would cost him. That is leadership of a different order. Jen Scott's in Time Force is worth naming here too, because she often gets placed at or near the top of franchise-wide leadership conversations, and the case for her is strong. Jen leads through a combination of professional discipline and emotional stakes that become almost overwhelming by the time the season is done. She is the leader who has the most to lose personally and refuses to let it compromise her mission. And then the finale reveals the cost of that refusal in a way that makes everything she suppressed suddenly visible. The emotional intelligence in Jen's leadership is real, but it runs differently from Zack's hypothetical version. Jen internalizes. She contains. Zack, in this alternate telling, externalizes. He creates the container for other people. Those are two different but equally valid expressions of emotional intelligence in a leader. And comparing them is genuinely interesting, rather than simply a question of who ranks above whom. Carter Grayson in Lightspeed Rescue is another benchmark. Carter is maximally competent, physically fearless, and carries the team on capability alone in ways that sometimes outpace his emotional availability to them. He is effective in a crisis in the way that a hammer is effective, exactly the right tool for the right moment, not always the most nuanced instrument for everything else. Tommy as White Ranger has some of this quality too, capable, present, but operating at a slight distance from the people he's leading. Zack as White Ranger sits closer to TJ in style than to any of the others, but I think the comparison needs some refinement. TJ is inclusive. Zack is inclusive and additionally warm in a way that TJ, who operates with a certain quiet steadiness, doesn't quite replicate. Where TJ's inclusion is principled. He brings people in because that's how good leadership works. Zack's inclusion feels more instinctive, more personal, more tied to a genuine interest in the people themselves, rather than a philosophy about how teams function. That distinction is subtle, but it matters in the day-to-day texture of what the team around him experiences. TJ's team trusts him. Zack's team, in this version, also loves him. And there is a difference between those two things when the stakes get very high. Where does that put him in a ranked conversation? I would say this. Zack Taylor as White Ranger team leader is plausibly upper tier in the conversation with Jason, TJ, Andros, and Jen, without claiming he automatically surpasses all of them. What he offers is a specific combination that is rare across the franchise. The warmth of TJ with more personal magnetism, the team cohesion that rivals Jason's original squad, and an emotional intelligence that the show, if it had done the work, could have made explicit in a way that would have set him apart from almost anyone else in the Zordon era. Whether he lands above TJ or Andros or Jen specifically depends entirely on execution. How well do the writers lean into what makes him different? How much of the humor as leadership idea actually makes it to screen? How much does the loss of Jason and Trini shape him in ways the audience can see? Those are questions about a season of television that was never made, and I'm not going to pretend I know exactly how it would have answered them. But here is what I am confident in. The floor for Zack Taylor as White Ranger team leader, given what was already in Walter Jones's performance before any of this even starts, is comfortably mid to upper tier. The ceiling, if the writers gave him what they gave Andros or Jen in terms of real emotional weight and genuine cost, the ceiling is as high as it gets in this franchise for this era. That is not a small claim, but it is an honest one. Tommy as White Ranger leads effectively, but to me, his leadership can feel a little more formal than Jason's. He leads like someone who earned the place through a process, which is true, and there's a subtle sense that he is growing into the role rather than simply being it, the way Jason was from the first moment. Zack's leadership would have had a different texture. There would have been no performance of the role because Zack was never auditioning for anything. He was already there. The White Ranger upgrade would not have changed who he was in the room. It would have simply made visible what had always been true. By the team cohesion measure, this alternate version of Zack Taylor as White Ranger leader is top tier. Not automatically above everyone, because that would be doing the same thing the show did with Tommy, anointing rather than earning, but plausibly in the conversation with Jason and TJ as the best of what the Zordon era produced. And with the emotional stakes that the loss of his two best friends would have given the alternate Season 2, plausibly making a claim on the kind of territory that Andros and Jen occupy in the conversations people have about this franchise's most fully realized leaders. The second choosing is everything. Zordon chose all of them the first time, but choosing Zack for the White Ranger powers would have meant Zordon saying, this one, specifically. Of all of them, this one has something the powers require. And that something was never darkness overcome. It was light maintained. The long, unglamorous, consistent work of showing up and holding the room together, and never making it about yourself. That is what the White Ranger powers, as the show's cleanest symbolic answer to evil, point toward. Not dramatic redemption. Steady integrity. Zack Taylor had that in him. The show saw it just enough to keep him interesting, and not enough to do anything real with it. And that is the gap at the center of this whole conversation. He was right there. He was always right there. Every week in Season 1, Walter Jones was doing work the scripts didn't ask for, and the promotional material didn't reflect. He was building a character who was more than his function in the plot. He was making Zack Taylor feel like a real person rather than a role, and that is harder than it looks on a show with production timelines like this one had. The result on screen was a character with genuine depth that the show kept choosing not to excavate. Not maliciously, just by always turning the camera somewhere else at the crucial moment. In the alternate Season 2, the camera finally turns. The reveal happens. Zack Taylor walks out of that chamber, and the music swells. And the team stares, and it is not the person they expected. And it is exactly the person it should have been. And from that moment, the show gets to find out who he is when the full weight of it lands on him. When Jason is gone, and Trini is gone, and he is the one Zordon looks to. When the new members of the team are looking to him for something solid to hold on to. When Lord Zed is applying pressure that the old structure wasn't designed to handle. When Kimberly is dealing with whatever she's dealing with and needs someone who already knows her. When Billy has the answer but needs someone to ask the question. When Rocky is trying to figure out where he fits. When Aisha asks Zack a question he hasn't asked himself yet. When Adam needs to be found before he knows he's lost. All of that is available. All of that is just sitting there, unused, in the character the show already made. The alternate Season 2 is not a fantasy built from nothing. It's the show that was already implicit in Walter Jones's performance, given the space to become explicit. We never got it, but we can see the shape of it. And the shape of it is something special. If you want more Power Rangers What Ifs, subscribe and check out more videos on the channel. Until next time, may the power protect you.